1943 began with the world locked in total war. For the Axis powers, 1942 had been a year of both victories and setbacks. Stalingrad was lost, North Africa was slipping away, and Japan's expansion had stalled after Midway. The illusion of Axis invincibility was beginning to crumble. In the East, the Soviet Union had survived the brutal winter of 1941–42. Now, with reinforcements and relentless resolve, the Red Army launched counter-offensives that would shock the world. The city of Stalingrad, once a symbol of Axis strength, had become a tomb for the German Sixth Army. Over months of brutal urban combat, Soviet forces encircled and ultimately defeated Hitler's elite units. Hundreds of thousands perished, and the psychological blow to Germany was immense. Stalingrad was more than a battle, it was a turning point. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the Allies were gaining momentum. The Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942 had forced Rommel's forces into retreat. By early 1943, Allied troops, led by General Montgomery, pressed the Axis back across the desert. Supply shortages, harsh terrain, and the relentless pursuit of Allied forces would eventually drive German and Italian troops from Africa entirely. Control of the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal now shifted to the Allies, opening new possibilities for invasion and supply routes. On the seas, the Battle of the Atlantic raged on. German U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, sinking convoys and threatening Britain's lifeline. But new technology, sonar, improved depth charges, and long-range aircraft, began to turn the tide. The Allies were learning to fight in every environment, from the air to the seas to the frozen steppes of Russia. In the Pacific, the fight against Japan was equally brutal. The campaign for Guadalcanal marked the first major Allied offensive against Japanese-held territory. Jungle warfare, disease, and grueling night battles tested the limits of soldiers on both sides. Control of the island would determine naval supremacy in the South Pacific. By early 1943, Guadalcanal had been secured by Allied forces, marking the beginning of a long push toward Japan. In Italy, the Allies prepared a new front. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 marked the start of the campaign to push Axis forces out of Europe from the south. Italian defenses crumbled faster than expected, and the fall of Mussolini's government soon followed. Italy, once a major Axis power, began to fracture internally, providing the Allies with a critical advantage. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was no longer on the defensive. Counter-offensives at Kursk in mid-1943 would solidify the shift in momentum. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers clashed across a vast front, and German forces suffered irreplaceable losses. From this point forward, the Soviet Union would hold the strategic initiative. By the end of 1943, the global balance of power had shifted. Germany, Japan, and Italy were no longer the uncontested masters of their territories. The Allies were coordinating across continents, advancing in multiple theaters, and slowly tightening the noose around Axis powers. 1943 proved one fundamental truth: no empire, no matter how aggressive or well prepared, could withstand the coordinated might, resilience, and determination of the Allied forces. The war had entered a new phase. It was no longer about survival. It was about liberation, retaliation, and the inevitable march toward victory. The year closed with the world bracing for 1944, a year that would bring unprecedented assaults, massive battles, and the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. 1943 had turned the tide. The question now was, how fast could the Allies strike, and how devastating would the next blows be? 1944 began with the Allies poised to strike at the heart of German-occupied Europe. The previous years had seen relentless warfare, the Eastern Front bleeding Germany, North Africa liberated, and the Pacific War turning in favor of the Allies. The time had come for the decisive offensives that would break the back of the Axis powers in Europe. The most ambitious operation in military history was about to unfold. On June 6, 1944, the world watched as thousands of ships, aircraft, and soldiers crossed the English Channel in what would become D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. Operation Overlord was a colossal gamble. Over 156,000 Allied troops stormed 5 heavily fortified beaches under relentless German fire. Paratroopers had been dropped behind enemy lines hours earlier, tasked with disrupting communication and supply lines. The success of the invasion depended on timing, coordination, and sheer courage. Across the beaches, chaos and heroism intertwined. Soldiers waded through cold waters, bullets whizzed overhead, and explosions tore through the sand. Many fell within minutes, but others pressed forward, determined to secure the beachheads. Tanks, artillery, and naval bombardments provided crucial support, gradually pushing German defenses back. By nightfall, the Allies had established a foothold in France, but the cost had been staggering. Normandy would not be won in a single day, it would take weeks of bloody combat. The months that followed were a relentless push across France. The Allies faced the hedgerows of Normandy, an intricate maze of natural defenses that slowed armored advances and allowed German forces to mount counterattacks. Cities were liberated one by one: Cherbourg, Caen, and ultimately Paris. On August 25, 1944, the French capital was freed from German occupation, a symbolic victory that ignited hope across Europe. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army continued its unstoppable advance. After the victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, Soviet forces pressed into Eastern Europe, reclaiming territories lost in the early years of the war. Cities such as Lvov, Minsk, and Warsaw witnessed fierce urban combat, with civilians caught in the crossfire. Soviet strategy combined massive artillery barrages, coordinated tank assaults, and relentless infantry pressure, gradually eroding German defensive lines. By late 1944, German forces were in full retreat on both eastern and western fronts. The air war also reached new intensity. Allied bombers targeted German industry, railways, and cities, attempting to cripple the war machine from the skies. Precision bombing and massive raids destroyed factories, fuel depots, and communication hubs. German cities such as Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin faced devastation, while the Luftwaffe struggled to defend its territory against the overwhelming Allied air power. In Italy, Allied forces pushed north after liberating Rome in June. The mountainous terrain slowed progress, and German forces used natural defenses to delay the Allied advance. Yet by the end of 1944, the Allies had made significant inroads, linking up with forces advancing from southern France and tightening the noose around German-held territory. 1944 was also the year of Ardennes preparations. Germany, desperate to reverse its fortunes, began planning a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. This would become the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, a final desperate attempt to split Allied forces in the West. For months, both sides anticipated the confrontation, positioning troops, supplies, and artillery for what would be the largest land battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. By the end of 1944, the strategic picture was clear. Germany was fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. France and Belgium were being liberated by Western Allied forces. The war had shifted irreversibly. 1944 was the year the Allies regained the initiative, demonstrating that total coordination, industrial might, and relentless determination could finally push the Axis powers toward defeat. The world stood on the brink of victory, yet the final chapters of the war promised even greater challenges. Cities, armies, and civilians would face unparalleled suffering before peace could be restored. But for the first time since 1939, there was certainty that the end was in sight. 1944 was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end. 1945 began with the world on the brink of total collapse. Germany was crumbling under relentless pressure from east and west. The Allies had reclaimed France, Belgium, and much of the Low Countries. Soviet forces were advancing steadily through Eastern Europe, while the Western Allies pushed toward the Rhine. Hitler's empire, once vast and terrifying, was now surrounded, outnumbered, and outmatched. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union launched its final offensives. Cities that had once been German strongholds fell one by one. Warsaw, Budapest, and Vienna were liberated as Soviet troops swept across Poland, Hungary, and Austria. Urban combat was brutal. Street by street, house by house, soldiers fought in ruins where every corner could conceal an enemy. Millions of civilians were caught in the crossfire, suffering alongside the combatants, yet hope grew with every liberated city. Meanwhile, in the West, Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany. After crossing the Rhine in March 1945, U.S., British, and Canadian forces advanced deep into the heart of the Third Reich. Cities such as Cologne, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg were liberated after fierce fighting. The speed and coordination of the Allies left German forces disoriented, and surrender became increasingly common. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, Hitler remained isolated in his underground bunker. Berlin itself became the stage for one of the war's final and most destructive battles. Soviet forces encircled the city in April, beginning a relentless assault. Artillery fire and aerial bombardment reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Civilians endured unspeakable suffering as soldiers fought for every street and building. By late April, the city was completely encircled. Hitler, realizing the war was lost, took his own life on April 30, 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing from within. On May 2, Berlin fell to Soviet forces. The German military, fractured and exhausted, could no longer resist. On May 7, 1945, Germany formally surrendered, ending the war in Europe. Victory in Europe was celebrated, but the cost had been staggering. Tens of millions of soldiers and civilians had died. Entire cities had been leveled. The horrors of the Holocaust and other atrocities left a permanent scar on humanity. While Europe celebrated, the Pacific War raged on. Japan, though weakened, continued to resist. U.S. forces advanced across the Pacific island by island, engaging in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated the intensity and desperation of Japanese defense. Thousands of soldiers died in entrenched combat, and civilians were caught in the devastation. The war in the Pacific would end with a shocking and unprecedented decision. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing immediate and catastrophic destruction. Japan, recognizing that further resistance was futile, surrendered on August 15, 1945. On September 2, 1945, the formal signing of surrender aboard the USS Missouri marked the official end of World War II. 1945 was a year of unimaginable suffering, heroism, and sacrifice. It was the year empires fell, ideologies were defeated, and the world began the long, painful process of rebuilding. From the ruins of Europe and Asia emerged a new global order, a recognition of the need for cooperation, and a determination that such destruction should never happen again. World War II had lasted 6 years, consumed tens of millions of lives, and reshaped the entire planet. But by the end of 1945, the war was finally over. The Allies had prevailed. The Axis powers had been defeated. The world had survived the most destructive conflict in human history. And though the scars remained, the events of 1945 marked the beginning of hope, reconstruction, and a fragile peace. The years 1940 through 1945 had changed everything. Modern warfare had arrived, nations had been tested, and humanity had endured unimaginable trials. The story of World War II was one of courage, suffering, and resilience, a reminder of both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human determination. The war was over, but its lessons would endure forever.